Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone who could join us this evening. Jessica Karlsruher, Executive Director of TREAD Coalition. It stands for Texas Real Estate Advocacy and Defense. And we are your advocate and voice at the Capitol. Next slide. So TREAD's mission is to be a nonpartisan member-based organization that advocates for and defends the rights of landowners in rural communities at the federal, state, and local levels. And what that means is we participate in town halls and activities. And as a member, you are able to filter up what's happening in your own backyard. And if it's a statewide issue, then that's something that we take to the legislature and help advocate for. In addition, be able to provide resources to you so you can help steward your land and resources appropriately. Next slide. So who do we represent? It's a landowner who owns a large parcel of land, or anyone who lives in a rural community. I'm not sure if you all know, but 95% of the land in Texas is privately owned. 83% of that land in Texas is rural. And so there is a large opportunity for TREAD and other landowner organizations to be advocating for this huge group of landowners and people who live in these communities who are stewarding these farms, ranches, and other rural lands. Now, what we're seeing is there are 1,000 people moving to Texas every day. That is 700 acres of land being fragmented every day to rooftops and other commercial developments. And what that means is that there is urban encroachment and a depletion of not only land, but natural resources. And so depending on where you live in Texas, specifically if you live in the hill country, we are seeing a huge, massive population growth, and it's really putting a stress on what we know and love for our central Texas hill country. We're having, it's the wine capital of Texas. It's the wedding capital of Texas. We have lots of people coming in, and we're seeing that strain, in addition to just making sure that we have access to water and roads and transportation for anyone who lives in some of these outside communities. And so we're trying to address all of those issues and make sure that you have a voice as our state grows and changes. Next slide. So one of the things that we created at TREAD is a landowner education and advocacy center. And what that does is provide online resources and tools for you to find information for how to best steward your land. This includes partners and preferred vendors that we have who have a great track record, like Plateau Wildlife, for example, who we would want to make sure that you're put in touch with so you have the right people helping steward your land. You can ask all of the questions, you can get expert opinion. And if those folks don't have the answers, they have their own resources to people who could be helpful in those things. What we're seeing a lot of is there's something that we are hearing, ecosystem services. It's a new budding term. There are emerging markets that we are able to leverage what your property can do in terms of providing value and a portfolio for funding outside of your traditional farming and ranching, that would provide money, benefits, and incentives to landowners. And so making sure that you are in the right hands of those folks is a critical piece for us. And that way you are protected, your rights are protected, and you know how to best steward your land through those partnerships. Another thing that we do is we host town halls around the state, and this is to help address issues that are affecting your communities. It's also a great way for TREAD to be boots on the ground, hear your stories, and the more that we are out in the communities, we can identify issues that are statewide that help us hone in on what our legislative priorities need to be and what we need to advocate for. And you would think traditionally there would be, property taxes is something that we're always concerned about, but you'd be surprised because Texas is growing and changing so rapidly. There are a number of issues that we are all facing that we'll get into in the upcoming slides, but it's really critical that we try to be plugged in those communities, talking to you all and seeing what's really affecting you on a day-to-day basis. When we can't do that, because we are a small, lean organization, we created TREAD Talks. Now, TRED Talks are our online educational programming that brings together experts and a variety of panelists, including our peer organizations like a Texas Wildlife Association, a Texas Farm Bureau, anyone who's an expert on water, mitigation banking, those types of things, to provide additional information and resources for you to know what's readily available to you. And then we have follow-up that is, again, supported on our online resources, but that way you can access it from your own home. They're hour-long webinars, very similar to this, that just provide snippets of information and maybe help guide you in stewarding your land and your resources. Next slide. So what we have just embarked on is a legislative session. And I know that you all are familiar with how Texas runs the legislature. We're only in session every other year. It's 140 days. And so it is a mad rush to either get a bill through or kill it. And so we have been a slow moving process at the moment. The Senate has identified who the senators will be on their committees, and then the House should come out with their committee assignments. And essentially, those are critical pieces in order to see where these bills are going to land. And so we have a lot of bills that the legislature is looking at that are very critical to rural communities. Next slide. We specifically advocate for thoughtful energy infrastructure. Some of this intertwines with eminent domain, which many of you are familiar with, and that has to do with pipeline routing specifically for oil and gas companies, even though utilities also utilize eminent domain. Fundraising for state parks and ensuring that we have green spaces available for our Texans around the state. Water rights in Texas, which, as you know, has become a huge conversation. Fair property taxes that we're definitely feeling, again, as people have moved to our state, purchasing homes and ranches. That's kind of changed the scale of how we have looked at property taxes in the past. And then broadband in Texas. As we've seen what the last 3 years with winter storms being iced in, what we saw with COVID, having access in rural communities to education, telemedicine, all of those things have been critical components. And fortunately, this session, the legislature is addressing all of these issues. Next slide. So here is a snapshot of what has been filed so far. So there have been about 1,500 bills that have been filed in the legislative session, but there will be maybe upwards of 8,000 bills filed. So we are watching as they are focused, like I said, on the key issues that we are looking at: water, carbon capture. That kind of goes into what's happening with renewables in a way. It's a budding market, and some of you might be familiar with it, but you're definitely going to be hearing more about this carbon capture and sequestration in the future. Obviously, property tax relief is a very critical piece. And one thing I want to discuss too is, so there's a budget surplus that the comptroller has come out and said we have X amount of dollars that have been generated through oil and gas taxes and some other pieces, but we have nearly $33 million in surplus. And so what's critical about that number is that there are a lot of demands and requests for where those funds need to go. I will tell you the top two in mind that will be beneficiary to you all is water infrastructure and education. I'm sorry, not education, property taxes. So with water infrastructure, there has been an average of 6 boil water notices in Texas just in 2023. In 2022, there were more than 3,000 boil water notices in Texas. And so what that indicates is there is a huge need for an overhaul of water infrastructure, particularly in rural communities. And so that is something that we are going to be very much watching and advocating for. Additionally, we created a Texas Water Caucus. And what that means is there are members of the legislature who are either water experts or have specific interest or concerns about water in our state. And so they are those folks who are championing different focal points of what we can do with water infrastructure, what are the needs, and how do we address them. Additionally, we have a sportsman's caucus. We have a climate caucus that's addressing some of our climate concerns, and a rural caucus. And so we use all of those groups to kind of help spearhead our legislation. So I will say the key piece that we are carrying for this session, Senate Bill 624 filed by Senator Kolkhorst. We will be getting a House sponsor, but we're waiting for those committee assignments. But this is essentially putting a regulation around renewable energy. Now, I'm not sure if you are aware, but renewable energy has been rolling out at an aggressive rate around our state, and they have less regulation than the oil and gas industry. And basically what that means is they have none. And so we have heard enough complaints or concerns around the state around what this means long term. And so we have, let's say, a minimum of a 2,000 acre solar project that clears all of the vegetation and topsoil and then erects all of these panels. Well, what does that mean short-term and long-term for you as the landowner on your property? And then what's happening to the adjacent landowners? Not to mention what we see with the wind turbines that we've had popping up over the last couple of years. So this is going to help streamline a process. And for those of you who were involved with our eminent domain conversations last session, this is essentially the same thing. It's putting a process in place that helps route these renewable energy projects. It works with Texas Parks and Wildlife and Texas A&M AgriLife in order to do an environmental impact study, assess the siting and construction, and make sure that these are the best spots for these projects. That also helps protect the landowner because we have an impact fee that the company would have to pay every year, and a percentage of that goes into a cleanup fund that the state would manage. So if a company goes bankrupt and leaves the project before the end of its life cycle, or it's just abandoned in place for whatever reason, there's some recourse for landowners. So here are the existing wind and solar projects and future projects. And this was just projected through the end of last year. Now, some of these projects were trying to get a tax abatement. They did not make the deadline, and so the application was null and void. However, that does not stop the projects that are in the pipeline of coming to fruition. And so we still need to manage what is happening with the construction of these. Next. So what do you need to know? Next slide. Basically, there is no regulation, but the PUC, which is the Public Utility Commission, does oversee some of the wind. Otherwise, you just have to have clearance with the FAA to construct a wind turbine. Next slide. What do you need to know about solar? Next. And by the way, these are all images of projects that are existing in Texas. So the average project is 2,200 acres. You have these lease agreements that are locked in. They're large scale, but they tear up the topsoil and clear all the vegetation. Next slide. So it's the Public Utility Commission, ERCOT, and Railroad Commission who manage energy in Texas. Next slide. What you'll need to know about some of these is that some of these agencies have been in the Sunset Commission review, which means this is an opportunity to make these changes. And so next slide, the certification process is basically what I said. You have minimal regulation. There is a stormwater prevention plan that you can get with the Texas Center for Environmental Equality, and that's pretty much it. Next slide. So what we want to do, and these are this is a real-time letter saying, hey, this is all we can do. Sorry, there is no law. You need to change it in the legislature. And we go, okay, wait a second. Well, this is happening around the state, and I'm sure that many of you are concerned about these things. And so we want to make sure that you can work with TRED. Let us know if you've had an issue with some of these environmental projects, and we are here to advocate for you. And in real time, we have a bill that we have filed, and we're moving that needle, but we'd love to hear your story if you have one. Next slide. I'll go ahead and skip through because we're running out of time. So basically, we need a fair, transparent solution to energy infrastructure. And next slide. So we have an advocacy day coming up March 7th. If you are willing and able, we'd love to have you in Austin, Texas to advocate. You will receive these slides, so sorry it went fast. There's a lot of information, but I'll leave you with my contact information, and feel free to reach out to me and have a further conversation about how we can interact with you and we can be your voice at the Capitol. So with that, next slide. this is how you can join our coalition. And like I said, you'll have my contact information, and I look forward to working with you and advocating for you at the Capitol. Thank you for your time.
That was wonderful, Jessica. Thank you so much. I wish we could spend more time on this. It is such valuable information and things to be especially mindful of as we enter into the next legislative session.